in a vertebrate central nervous system, we talked brain and spinal cord. We know that's what it contains, but as far as the brain, let's look at a few features that make the vertebrate brain pretty special. It's fairly enlarged and very evolved compared to organisms that simply have neuron clusters for what we would consider a very early central nervous system. You do divide your brain out into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, and how that divides is like this. When you're an embryo developing inside mom, this is what your brain looks like. It's kind of a straight sort of stem, doesn't really look like anything we would consider a brain, but by 3 months into development, you start to develop something that looks a little bit more like a brain as we would think about it. Your forebrain is actually something that we see in a lot of higher order organisms. And the reason that is because the forebrain is involved much more in critical thinking and processing of information and integrating senses and all of these types of things. The midbrain and hindbrain, the brainstem, as we will see that's part of the midbrain, is very important for relaying information, but also dealing with things like heart rate and breathing. These are things that would be found in many more organisms other than those that are just top-end evolved organisms. Different than when we look at the forebrain, where we'll see that being the large part of your cerebral hemisphere, including the cerebral cortex, where we're going to integrate sensory and motor information and make decisions. So this central part, this midbrain, hindbrain kind of thing here, is more primitive and less evolutionarily advanced because we look at it being in many organisms that would have a brain type structure. The cerebral cortex, on the other hand, we develop larger as we see more evolved organisms. So this midbrain part with the hindbrain, thalamus, and hypothalamus, all things you may have heard of before, we're actually going to use this as a conduit or a conduction center to move information around the brain. We're going to use this for homeostasis. This is also going to be involved in body position. So are you sitting up, laying down? What are you doing? Okay. And sorting out sensory information. So this area of the brain is really responsible for making sure the information gets from and to the right place inside your brain. And it sits here in the center. So we said thalamus is a big part of it. Hypothalamus we see as a large part of it. And the hindbrain, which is going to include structures further back for us here. And this is actually as if you were looking at the back of my head. Okay, so left on the left side, right on the right side. And when we look at most of this, you see a large part of it is the cerebrum, which is the higher order thinking and critical thinking and processing. The cerebellum, we'll see later, is involved in hearing and balance. But the cerebrum, that largest part of the forebrain, largest and most complex, we're going to look at integration being its primary role. So integration of information, particularly in what we call the cerebral cortex. So cortex is always the outside layer. So in this case, looking basically at the covering on your cerebrum, and this is what your brain would actually look like. So we often have divided the left and the right side of your brain by left being kind of verbal and logical, right being the nonverbal and creative. We found in recent years this is much less so. We don't see this in the same regard, but we still look at the majority of those centers occurring, as I've mentioned, so verbal and logical associated with left hemisphere, processing information, and if you would have a stroke on the left side of your brain, we often look at it as affecting your ability to speak, as opposed to the right hemisphere where we look at the creative and the nonverbals, more of a specific approach to things, less a global vision for things. A stroke on the right side leads to something known as neglect syndrome, which actually occurs in pregnant women during childbirth. We look at this essentially having a small stroke typically in the right side of the brain that causes them to actually have no interest in their child once it's born. And we see this more often than you might expect, and some people are able to work through it quite well and others can't. Like I said, we aren't dividing out so much the sides of the brain because we found if you injure one side of your brain, the other side of the brain can actually compensate for some of the things that the injured site might have been responsible for. But regardless, we look at these layers associated with your brain. So the outermost layer is something we refer to as gray matter. And gray matter is called that because it literally is gray. These are unmyelinated cells or axons associated with the neurons. So remember, myelination meant insulation. So if they're unmyelinated, if we have no insulation, that means that the signal slows down, right? So if the signal decreases, why would it do that in the brain on the outside layer? The entire cerebral cortex is gray. I told you it's all for processing, right? We need to slow down the signal just a little bit so that we can start processing things fast or more efficiently. And you notice here it's less than 5 millimeters thick. It's not like it's your entire brain, okay? Inside your brain, you have all white matter, which is myelinated axons. So this is associated with midbrain, hindbrain. This is fast responses for your brain to be able to transmit information, get homeostasis back into line, all of those things. With our cerebral cortex, we actually have three major types of areas. Motor areas, so voluntary kinds of areas. Sensory areas, to interpret our senses. And then association areas. And the difference here is we're actually going to integrate sensory and motor and decide how you want to respond. We also start to pull in things like memories and so on. The prefrontal cortex is critical to our personalities. So if the airline loses your luggage, how do you respond? The reason you respond the way you do is because of your prefrontal cortex. Some people get very mad, some people don't care, right? So think about that. The association areas that we're interested in, the frontal association and the somatosensory association areas here versus auditory and visual, as you might expect, auditory is associated with hearing and visual is associated with your eyes. But when we look at somatosensory and frontal, what I want to think about is how we actually divide out those areas so that you can do something that we call lateralization. Lateralization looks at the right and left hemispheres tending to specialize in different mental tasks, but you'll see here that they're actually closely associated. So when we look at our somatosensory and motor areas, they look like headbands across the top of his head here, right? The green one is somatosensory, and the blue is the motor. So we're bringing in information to the green band, and the blue band is sending out information as a response. So why is that so important here? Well, let's look just for a second. I think this is a very cool image in biology. Where are your most sensitive areas of your body? Keep it PG, please. Right? Fingers, lips, tongue. Have you ever hit your thumb with a hammer? Oh, you know how sensitive it is, right? Okay. So they've attempted to show you here on the right side of your screen where you would have the most sensory information coming in. Nose, eyes, tongue. But then where do you have the best motor skills going back out again? Where do you have your fine motor skills? Same sorts of things, right? Fingers, eyes, nose, lips, tongue, right? Interesting to think about. And we see these very distinct differences. So if you would actually have a stroke that affected part of your sensory information coming in, you wouldn't be able to connect into the motor and then send out a response from there. So these are important things to consider when we think about your brain. We also have to keep you awake, right? So there are a number of things that actually keep you awake and what we call aroused or awake and interested in what's going on versus sleepy state. So your hypothalamus and medulla oblongata, pons, something known as the reticular formation, all very important for regulating sleep. Some of them are based on your homeostasis, so breathing and heart rate. Others are based more on shutting down senses such as ears and eyes so that you can get some rest. And the whole idea with sleep is that it's actually required for your survival. So it decreases your external sensory system and your ability to detect external senses, but we know that we actually increase much brain activity during this time. And we think the reason you do that is it actually might be important for learning, memory, and many folks look at it kind of as a system reboot and clean up of your brain. And it allows us to process information through that we're going to put into long-term retrieval or long-term storage of memories and make room for new things.